Hello, everyone. It's Rafael Gutierrez. I wanted to try to do something live. I'm running a couple minutes late, but hopefully someone will come and join us soon. And one of the reasons there's a lot of reasons why I'm doing this. One of which is, I'm going to look at the lighting and see if I can get this better. Right, there we go. One of the reasons I'm doing this is I have found that there are a lot of people who want to know the truth about how the body works in martial arts. And so I decided to make a video of this. Now, one of the things, as I wait to see if anyone comes, I will actually mention is one of the things that happens is a lot of times there's videos made and the people who make them really don't understand what they're talking about. It's not a bad thing. It's not necessarily a thing that they're trying to get wrong information out. It's just they don't have the training to understand what they're doing. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to set this up so that I could answer questions and pretty much help people understand the basics of the human body. Now, who am I to even teach this? Well, I do have an MD. I actually had some training I went to England and I ended up seeing some stuff in the hospitals there. I went to Kansas City. I learned a bit in the hospitals there. And when I finished, I realized that there was other things I wanted to do. Mostly I did want to follow my passion, which is martial arts. And so that's where I went with. Now, I do see that there's one more person on, so hopefully that's, if they have any questions, they will ask. I don't know how all this works, so please let me know if there's something I'm doing wrong. If I can't see your question and you ask one and I don't answer it, I'm sorry. It just means that I didn't see what I was actually looking at. Now, this is live, so any mistakes I make are going to be pretty much visible to everyone. And I am going to leave this up for a while, and I'm hoping that in a month or so, I might make another one, especially if there is some interest in this. Hopefully, I'll actually start on time instead of 14 minutes late. My fault for that. And what I'm going to actually talk about is skin. The reason I'm talking about skin, and I'm going to actually deal a lot with martial arts, is this. Skin is one of those systems that a lot of people don't really pay attention to until there's a problem. People believe certain things that sometimes don't match what we actually know about skin. And so that's one of the big things that I wanted to give people is the reality of skin. Big thing that I'm going to tell you is skin is not a tissue. And that's one thing a lot of people make mistakes. They think skin is one tissue. The reason is this. The way the body's organized is you have cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. You have tissues, which are cells with some sort of other stuff attached to it. And they tend to look a certain way. Then you have organs. Skin is an organ. It's made up of multiple tissues, which end up being able to work a certain way. And there's a vocabulary that goes with this. And so that's actually what I'm going to try to do is try to get everything in there. Now, there are going to be some words that you're going to come across over and over again. And I am going to mention them and show you what they are and how to actually interpret what's going on. And the nice thing about anatomy is a lot of the language is telling you exactly what something is. So first, I do want to just give you a basic introduction to tissues. Tissues are cells with a collection of other stuff, which most people refer to as matrix. You can really think of 4 different types of tissues. And if you watched the video on skin before, you've already know this. The first tissue I would actually talk about is epithelial or endothelial tissue. These tissues tend to line organs. But besides that, they have something else. If you look at it, you'll see a lot of cells relative to the matrix you have, meaning you'll see cells and then you'll see a very little amount of proteins that are holding it together. The outer layer of skin is made up of this type of tissue, epithelial tissue. You also have connective tissue, and skin does have connective tissue. And connective tissue pretty much holds different things together. In the majority of the connective tissue in skin that we're going to deal with is going to be something called dense irregular connective tissue. And you'll see why it is. If you watch the video, you'll see it a little bit more if you watch the other video on skin. Then the last tissue that is involved in the skin is adipose. But there are other things in there. For instance, in skin there are some blood vessels that kind of come in to feed the things. There's capillaries. There's a lot of little things that are important. And then there's actually something else that people forget. And that is the non-eukaryotic cells, the cells that are not part of the human body, which help make things work right. For instance, on the outer layer of skin, you do have a lot of bacteria, and that normal bacteria tends to give you protection. So that's one thing to actually look at. So there are a couple terms I want you to know. One of them is for skin, anytime you hear the word epi, and I may have to write bigger. Anytime you see the word epi, it means on top. Anytime you see hypo, it means below. And the word we're going to deal with skin mostly is the word dermis. So we have 3 layers of skin. We have the epidermis, which technically means a layer on top of the skin. We have the dermis and the hypodermis. If you're one of the people who is taking anatomy, some people, instead of using hypodermis, they'll use subcutaneous. Roughly, there's actually a couple little differences, but roughly you're going to get the same thing. Now, one of the other things that's happening is I'm trying to work with the light, see which one works better for us. That tends to reflect too much on the back. I guess that's probably the best we can get. So we have epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Now, each one of these is made out of a different type of tissue. The epidermis, being the top layer, is made up of a bunch of cells. And like I said, it's a type of tissue called epithelial tissue. Now, the dermis tends to have a kind of border with the dermis, which is fingers on what they call dermopapillae. And you have a bunch of cells. Now, as you go up from that layer between the dermis and epidermis, the cells start to get more and more flat. As we look at these cells getting flat, what ends up happening is they start losing structures and they start losing proteins, and eventually they die. And what they do form is a layer of proteins over it. I'm going to make the proteins brown. It's a little different color. So you have a layer of proteins which doesn't have cells, which is called keratin. So this type of tissue, as it has keratin, it's called keratinized. As it's multiple layers, they call it stratified. And as the cells tend to be more flat, especially as you go away from the lower level, the basement membrane, which is here, they're called stratified squamous epithelium. Special type because as it has a keratin, it's keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Now, there are certain things in there you can actually feel some pressure and vibrations, and in neuro I'll talk more about those. I just want to get the basics of the cell. You do have different layers of the epithelium. If you're going into them, there's stratum basalis, but for now we'll just deal with this. The other thing that the skin has is it has glands coming from down here, and they produce a oil to pretty much coat the top of the skin. We will have some glands coming this way. We also do have hair, some of us more than others. These are protective organs. These are protective things for the skin. You do have erector pillae, which are muscles that help the hair stand up when you're cold or scared. But that's not going to be too important as when we talk about this clinically. When we get to the dermis, we have a different type of tissue. Instead of having a lot of cells, we have cells and a lot of matrix. That matrix is usually made of fibrous tissue. You have collagen, you have elastic fibers, and they're arranged in a kind of chaotic way, but they're kind of dense. Now, if you were to take your hand and you pinch the skin and pull it up, you'll notice it has elasticity. That's because of this layer, of the dermis, which is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. It allows the stretching to occur. And it does have proteins going everywhere and a couple cells in here. Now, another thing that's important is between the dermis and epidermis, you have capillary beds. Now, usually, when you cut yourself, usually when you scratch yourself or you get a little bleeding in the skin, this is actually where you're bleeding from. If you cut yourself when you're shaving, unless it's a really deep cut, this is what you're cutting. This is not deep. This is not deep. This isn't getting into the deeper structures. This is still on the top layer of skin. Now, one of the big things that I would tell you is if we were to look at the top layer of the skin, we're actually talking about the dermis being about 0.3 millimeters, 0.1 millimeter is about average. Underneath the dermis, we actually do have a layer that is, it can vary, but it actually varies. It's usually around, 3 centimeters? And then we have the hypodermis, which will actually vary, can get as far as 2 millimeters. So you're talking about a big differentiation. Now, the epidermis, again, is the first layer of skin. And I'm going to pause on this because I want you, especially if you're a martial artist and if you do a lot of makiwara, I want you to look at the skin on your knuckles. If you're not, if you're interested in that, I also want you to look at, if you have your feet and you look at your calluses on your feet. And I want you to think of this. If you pinch your calluses, if you play with them, you actually will notice that they can sometimes flake off and it doesn't hurt. If you are a makiwara person, you're constantly training to get more and more, sometimes you will develop the calluses. And what you're actually building up is the keratin of the skin. That's not all. There's actually other ways you can actually do this. Thus, increasing the amount of keratin on your skin pretty much helps you deal with repetitive trauma. That's why makiwara can tend to change the skin on your knuckles. Now, the dermis, interesting thing, can also grow. It has specialized cells there, and with repetitive trauma. Now, it doesn't have to be severe trauma. A lot of people are like, oh, you just have to hit as hard as you can, and you're going to get these changes. No, it's actually repetitive trauma. If you think about it, if you wear ill-fitting shoes, you can actually get calluses there. If you work with tools, a lot of times you'll get calluses because of the repetitive trauma of the tool in your hands. It doesn't mean that, oh, you have to tear your hands to get calluses. It just means that with usage, you will actually can build up the dermis, the epidermis, which is dense connective tissue. And then we get into the hypodermis. And the hypodermis is made up of a specialized connective tissue called adipose tissue. Now, some of us carry more adipose tissue than others. This is actually what we're talking about. We actually have found that women tend to have a little bit more adipose in the hypodermis than men. And in this area, you have bigger blood vessels. So here's the thing. For you to actually cut into skin, you're going through the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. And in the hypodermis, you will have some little blood vessels, which can be cut. But again, cutting this is not a big deal. Now, just to let you guys know how deep you have to cut. A lot of times I've actually seen videos where someone grabs a knife and they're doing this. They're taking someone and they're doing this and saying, oh yeah, this would be cutting, doing damage. Truth is, skin is a lot harder to cut than people actually realize. What I mean by that is this. To actually penetrate the entire skin, you need to go in about 1/8 of an inch. If you actually think of an inch, something like this, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/8 of an inch. It's actually a thick amount of material. The other thing people forget is skin is not a delicate thing. if you actually think of how often you've hit yourself, how often you bump into things that may cut your skin don't necessarily go through the skin. A lot of times we actually, when we do have cuts, it's just at the epidermis, maybe in the dermis. It's not going through the entire 3 layers of skin. So a lot of times these little movements that people think, oh yeah, you're cutting, they're superficial. It's dangerous because of the blood to blood transfer, but it's not going to be something that's necessarily going to be that big of a deal. Now, I remember I talked to a gentleman who, when I mentioned this, and I was doing a seminar for someone, when I mentioned this, they said that when they got their certificate to teach a Filipino martial art, at the end of their test, they were actually told to slaughter a pig. And the reason they were told to slaughter a pig is, one is they needed something to eat to celebrate. The other thing that they did is, the reason they did it is so they actually could see just how hard it was to cut the skin. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what, pig and human are a lot different. But if you actually look at the thickness of skin, the thickness of skin between pigs and human isn't really that different. There are some areas of skin where in a pig, which is going to be thinner than humans, a couple areas where it might be a little thicker, but overall, you actually have similar averages. Now, if you want to test this, what I usually would tell people is to go to a butcher shop and buy pig skin. You can actually buy pig's feet, and you can play with the skin there, and you'll notice that the skin is pretty similar in texture as human skin. And look at how hard it is to actually cut that. Look at how hard it is to tear it. So a lot of times when you're actually looking at skin, a lot of people actually come with these ideas where, oh, well, we're just going to cut the skin and go through. And it takes a lot to go through this. There are special knives, obviously, that help you go through skin. But it actually is a lot harder than most people think. If you know anyone who pretty much hunts and they've cleaned their own food, they'll tell you how hard it is to go through animal hide. You can actually talk to doctors about stitching, or nurses about stitching, and how hard it is to actually get a needle into that. So, big thing to actually think about is this. A lot of times in karate, people talk about different applications for different things. We do have the epidermis, the dermis, and hypodermis, where these are actually layers of protection for you. Some people will say, oh, well, you're going to grab someone and tear off their, I think one of them was their ear. Well, if you actually take the ear, if you actually take the pig skin, like I was telling you, and try to tear it, you'll realize that you need a lot of force and power to actually tear a piece of meat off. There are actually, if you look at it, whenever someone bleeds, you'll notice it's usually in the same spots in boxing, and it has to do with bony projections under the skin. Now, I didn't get too many viewers, only one person, and they were kind of quiet. So I did talk a little bit about the skin, as I said I was going to. If you watch this later on and you enjoy it and you think that you may have some questions, please write them down on comments and I'll answer as soon as I can. If you think you may have enjoyed this, if we would have done it at a better time, let me know and I'll do it then. Again, I'm hoping to do a little thing on the biology of martial arts and pretty much see if I can help people who are interested in human anatomy and physiology. Hope you enjoy this and have a nice day.